And good thing your wife's dead, she'd faint seeing that outfit. Don't bother sitting in the front row, Dad. You're embarrassing my brand. My daughter-in-law Kimberly hissed those words into my ear while pressing a crisp $100 bill into my palm. We were in the foyer of the O'Connell Funeral Home in downtown Greenwich. Outside, a light Connecticut rain blurred the windows. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and expensive cologne. I was wearing the suit I'd bought for our 30th anniversary. It was wool high quality, but the cuffs were undeniably frayed, and the cut was from a different decade. To me, it was a suit of memories. To Kimberly, it was a social liability. Kimberly adjusted her oversized Prada sunglasses even indoors. She was staring at her reflection in the foyer mirror, smoothing her black silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. My son Julian stood 3 feet away, his thumbs flying across his phone screen. He was checking the pre-market trading for his firm, his brow furrowed in a permanent scowl of stress. He didn't even look up when his wife insulted his father. He had become a ghost in a bespoke suit, haunted by the ghost of his own ambition. I looked down at the $100 bill crumpled in my hand. It felt dirty. I reached out, took Kimberly's designer clutch, and slid the money back inside. Kimberly? I whispered, my voice steady as a heartbeat. You've spent so much on your face that you've clearly run out of budget for a soul. Keep the 100. You're going to need it when the credit card bills arrive this evening. I know Julian's firm isn't doing as well as your Instagram suggests. Her jaw dropped, her perfectly glossed lips parting in shock. Julian finally looked up, his eyes widening as he caught the tail end of the exchange. I didn't wait for a rebuttal or a fake apology. I turned my back on them, head high, and walked into the chapel. I took my seat in the very center of the front row, right next to my wife's mahogany casket. The game of silence was over. The strategy of the poor widower had just begun. The service was a parade of who's who in the tri-state area. My wife Evie had been a librarian for 40 years. She was a woman of service, a woman who remembered every child's favorite book and every neighbor's birthday. She believed in the quiet dignity of a life well lived. But as I sat there, I realized Julian and Kimberly had turned her morning into a networking event. They were shaking hands with local politicians and hedge fund managers as if this were a cocktail party and not a farewell. During the eulogy, Julian stood at the podium. He didn't talk about how Evie taught him to read using the stars, or how she worked extra shifts at the university library to pay for his Ivy League tuition so he wouldn't have to take out loans. Instead, he spoke about legacy, financial foundations, and generational wealth. He used corporate buzzwords to describe a woman who hated corporations. Every word was code for the inheritance he assumed was waiting for him. He looked at me during the speech, a patronizing pity in his eyes, as if I were a burden he was preparing to manage. I sat there feeling the weight of the small leather-bound ledger tucked into my jacket pocket. For 30 years, Evie and I had lived a life of deliberate simplicity. Neighbors saw the dented Ford in our driveway. They didn't see the compounding interest in the diversified brokerage accounts. They saw the librarian and the high school teacher. They didn't see the early investors in the tech boom of the 90s. I always told Evie, true wealth is the part people can't see. Once they see it, they try to take it. As the service ended, Kimberly leaned over my shoulder. We're hosting a celebration of life at the Greenwich Country Club tonight, Frank. Try to stay in the corner and just smile. We told everyone you're struggling with memory issues lately. It explains the outfit and why you're being so prickly. We just want to protect your image. Oh, I remember everything, Kimberly, I replied, not looking at her. I remember who stayed in the hospital room during Evie's final 48 hours, and I remember who was posting photos of their spirit retreat in Cabo. Don't worry about my image. Worry about your own. The light in this room is very unforgiving to Botox. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 a.m. on Tuesday. It hadn't even been 48 hours since Evie was laid to rest. I was in the kitchen, the heart of our home, where the linoleum was worn thin in front of the sink, and the walls were covered in Julian's old finger paintings and high school diplomas. I was drinking coffee when Julian and Kimberly walked in. They didn't bring breakfast. They brought a thick, black leather folder. "Dad, we've been up all night looking at the property taxes and the maintenance costs on this place," Julian started. He was pacing the kitchen, his leather shoes clicking on the floor. He refused to sit down. "It's too much for you. The roof needs work. The stairs are a liability, and honestly, the neighborhood is changing. We've done the research and found a wonderful senior boutique over in Scottsdale, near the golf courses." "A boutique?" I asked, watching a bird at the feeder outside. "Is that the new marketing term for a nursing home, Julian? Or is it a place where you park the things you don't want to look at anymore?" "It's luxury, Frank," Kimberly snapped, pulling a brochure from the folder. "Private suites, organic meals, a spa. But we need to move fast. The market in this zip code is peaking. If we list this house by Friday, we can clear enough to pay off. I mean to secure your future for the next 20 years. It's the responsible thing to do." I set my cup down slowly. I looked at Julian, who was staring at his reflection in the toaster. He wasn't worried about my safety or my future. He was sweating through his shirt because he knew his lifestyle was a house of cards. I knew he was 3 months behind on his mortgage for that 5-bedroom mansion in New Canaan. I knew his success was built on debt. "And what about my workshop?" I asked. "What about the garden where we buried our old golden retriever? What about the 40 years of life in these walls?" "Dad, be realistic," Julian said, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "You were a teacher. Mom was a librarian. You're one broken hip away from total bankruptcy. We're trying to save you from ending up in a state ward. Just trust us. We're the professionals here." I decided to play the part they expected. I let my shoulders slump. I let my hand shake slightly as I reached for my coffee. "I suppose I have to consider the move," I whispered. I watched their faces transform. The predatory glint in Kimberly's eyes was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She practically glowed. "That's my guy," Kimberly said, reaching out to pat my hand with her manicured fingers. "It's for the best. We'll handle all the heavy lifting. You won't even have to pack. We'll hire a service to sort through the clutter. However," "Stia," I said, pausing until they both leaned in, "I'll need to see the paperwork for the house sale first, and I'd like to understand how the proceeds will be managed." Julian pulled a second document from the folder. "Actually, Dad, we consulted a friend who specializes in elder law. Given your emotional state and the grief, we think a power of attorney is the safest route. It lets Kimberly and me handle the stress of the finances, so you can just focus on your golf and your health. It's a standard protective measure." I scanned the document. It was a masterpiece of greed. It wasn't just a power of attorney. It was a total surrender of my autonomy and every asset Evie and I owned. They wanted the right to sell the house, liquidate the bank accounts, and decide my allowance. "You want me to sign this today?" I asked, looking at the dotted line. "The notary is coming at noon," Kimberly said, her eyes darting to her watch. "We've already prepaid the fees. We just want to get you settled so we can stop worrying about you, Frank. It's been so hard on Julian seeing you like this." "I think I'd like my own witness," I said, standing up. "My old friend James Vance. He's just down the street." Julian rolled his eyes. "Vance. That old guy from the VFW, Dad. He's a retired public defender who spent his career in traffic court. He doesn't know anything about Greenwich Estates. This is a family matter. We don't need outsiders." "He's not an outsider," I said, picking up the kitchen phone. "He's my friend, and he's already on his way." James Vance arrived 10 minutes later. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a flannel shirt, faded jeans, and work boots. He looked like exactly the kind of failure Julian and Kimberly despised. He tipped his cap to me and took a seat at the kitchen table, pulling a legal pad from his bag. Julian treated him with a cold, dismissive nod. "Let's get this over with, Mr. Vance." Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. My father is ready to sign. We're just trying to consolidate his assets to pay off Mom's remaining medical debts and settle the estate. It's a very straightforward family transition. James adjusted his glasses and leaned over the power of attorney document. Straightforward, Julian. This document gives you the right to sell Frank's primary residence without his consent and move the funds into an account where he isn't even a co-signer. That's a bit aggressive for settling debts. Wouldn't you say? There are massive medical bills. Kimberly yelled, her composure finally breaking. The funeral was nearly $30,000. We've been out of pocket for months. We are drowning in the costs of keeping this family afloat. I pulled a manila folder from the drawer under the fruit bowl. I opened it and spread 3 receipts on the table. Actually, Kimberly Evie was a state employee for 40 years. She had a platinum health plan that covered 99% of her care. And we prepaid our funeral arrangements back in 2010. I have the receipts here. The total cost to you, Julian, was exactly $0. The kitchen went silent. The only sound was the humming of the old refrigerator. Julian turned to his wife, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. Kimberly's eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit or a new lie. Dad, what is this? Julian stammered. Why do you have these? Well, this, I said, is the part where you tell me the truth. How much do you actually owe the bank on that new Canaan mansion, Julian? And is it true that your firm put you on involuntary leave because of the discrepancies in your expense reports? Julian's face went from white to a mottled, angry purple. The high-flying executive persona he had cultivated for a decade finally shattered. He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. He looked like a tired, broken man, but I felt no pity. Pity is for those who are honest about their struggles. It's the economy, Dad, he shouted into his palms. Everyone in my circle is struggling. The bonuses didn't come through last year. Do you know what it's like to live in a neighborhood where appearances are everything if I don't drive that car? If Kimberly doesn't have those bags, people smell blood. I'm just trying to survive. By cannibalizing your father? I asked. By taking the house Evie worked her whole life to pay off. We didn't live in this mothball house because we were poor, Julian. We lived here because it was enough. We worked double shifts, me at the school and cleaning offices at night, Evie at the library to pay for your Ivy League dream. We gave you a debt-free start. You traded that for a boat and a vanity project. Kimberly stood up, her voice like a jagged blade. Listen to me, you old goat. You're sitting on a $2 million lot in a prime Greenwich neighborhood. You're 80 years old. You don't need it. We do. If you don't sign these papers, we'll take you to court. We'll tell the judge you're delusional. We've already taken photos of the clutter in your workshop. We'll call it a hoarding situation. We'll have a conservator appointed before you can even find your dentures. I looked at James. He didn't say a word. He just tapped his phone on the table. It had been recording the entire conversation. Is that so? I said, leaning back. You'd testify under oath that I'm incompetent just to get a commission on my house sale. In a heartbeat, Kimberly sneered, her mask of family love completely gone. Family is a two-way street, Frank. And right now you're just a roadblock. Sign the papers, or we make this very, very ugly for you. James, I said, my voice calm and cold. I think it's time to show them the portfolio. Since they're so concerned about my incompetence in managing money. Julian looked up, his brow furrowed. Portfolio, Dad. You have a pension and maybe $50,000 in a savings account. Don't make this harder on yourself by hallucinating wealth. James pulled a certified statement from a major brokerage firm out of his bag. He laid it on the table. The Frank and Evelyn O'Connell Private Wealth Trust. Established in 1982. Primary holdings, early-stage investments in Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon. Subsequent reinvestments in diversified index funds and commercial real estate in Austin, Texas. James flipped to the final page. Current liquidity, $11.4 million. Real estate assets outside of this residence, $3 million. Total net worth of the man you just called a roadblock, $14.4 million. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like the walls were closing in. Kimberly actually sat down, her legs giving out. Her expensive sunglasses slid off her head and clattered to the floor. Julian stared at the numbers, his lips moving as he tried to count the zeros. "Ja, 14 million, Julian whispered. "How you? You lived like paupers. I grew up eating generic cereal and wearing hand-me-downs. You let me believe we were just getting by. We lived like people who valued freedom over flash, Julian," I said. "We wanted to make sure that when we were gone, you'd have a foundation. But Evie and I made a pact. We'd wait until you were 40 to reveal the trust. We wanted to see what kind of man you'd become, without the lure of a massive inheritance. We wanted to see if our values would take root." I looked at him, my heart finally hardening, and we got our answer. We watched you become a man who mocks his father's clothes and plots to steal his home. You didn't just fail the test, Julian. You burned the classroom down. Julian gasped, his voice cracking. He stood up and tried to move toward me, his hands shaking. I had no idea. This changes everything. We were so stressed. The debt was making us crazy. We can fix this. We'll move in, we'll renovate the house, we'll get you the best doctors in the world. We'll be here for you every single day. Oh, I'm sure you would be, I said, stepping back so he couldn't touch me. Now that I'm a valuable asset again. But I recall you calling me a dead end and embarrassing not 10 minutes ago. Your love seems to have a very specific price tag. Kimberly tried to force a tear out of her eyes. It looked like a glitch in her makeup. "Frank, honey, I was just projecting. I was so worried about Julian's career that I lashed out. We're family. Family forgives. Think of your grandchildren." "I am thinking of them," I said. "I'm thinking about how I don't want them raised with your brand of morality. James, what are the updated instructions for the O'Connell Trust?" James read from a new document. "As of this morning, the trust has been restructured into a charitable foundation. The residence is to be donated to the Librarian Sanctuary, a non-profit that provides housing for retired public servants. The liquid assets are being moved into a scholarship fund for underprivileged students in this district. Julian O'Connell is to receive, let me see here, the sum of $1 as per the legal requirement to acknowledge an heir." "You can't do that!" Kimberly screamed, her voice reaching a shrill peak. "That's our future. We are your only heirs. You're stealing from your own blood." "No," I said, standing tall. "This money was built on my sweat and Evie's sacrifice. It was built on the quiet dignity you mocked. It doesn't belong to blood that is this cold. It belongs to the community that Evie actually loved." "James and I have already been busy this morning," I said, pointing toward the door. "The notary you hired for the power of attorney I called and canceled them. I also hired a locksmith. He's finished with the front and back doors. Your keys, Julian, no longer work." Julian looked at me with a mixture of horror and realization. "You're kicking me out after Mom just died. Where am I supposed to go, Dad? The bank is going to take the house in New Canaan. We have nothing." "You have your brand, Kimberly," I said, looking at her. "Maybe you can post a photo of your struggle. I'm sure your followers will be very supportive. Julian, there is a small box on the porch. It has your childhood baseball trophies and a few old photos of you and your mother before you decided she wasn't successful enough for your friends. Take it and go. You're disowning your only son." Julian asked, his voice a pathetic whimper. "You disowned me the moment you tried to gaslight me into a nursing home so you could pay off your credit cards," I replied. "I'm not disowning you, Julian. I'm giving you exactly what you wanted, a life without me in your way. I'm letting you grow up at age 42. Maybe without the safety net of my clutter. You'll find the boy I used to be so proud of. But you won't find him using my money." I watched them walk out of my kitchen. James stood by the door to ensure they didn't take anything else. Kimberly was already screaming at Julian in the driveway, her voice muffled by the closing of the heavy oak door. I watched through the window as they drove away in a car they couldn't afford, leaving nothing behind but the exhaust fumes of their own greed. I'm sitting on my back porch now. The rain has stopped, and the Connecticut air is crisp and clean. The old wool suit is currently at the dry cleaners not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I want it preserved for the foundation's opening ceremony. It is the suit of a man who was underestimated, and there is great power in that. I've learned a hard lesson over these last few days. People often say that money ruins families, but I don't think that's true. Money is just a spotlight. It shines a light on the cracks that were already there. It shows you who is willing to stay when the room is dark, and who is only there for the glitter. Julian and Kimberly didn't change because of the trust. They were revealed by it. I am not a failure. I am not a memory-impaired burden. I am Frank O'Connell. I am a man who worked 40 years in a school, who loved a good woman with a librarian's heart, and who kept his dignity when those I loved tried to trade it for a luxury lifestyle. Evie was right. The best part of our wealth was the part no one could see. It gave me the power to walk away. Tonight, I'm going to sit in my workshop and breathe in the smell of cedar shavings. I'm going to have a glass of wine and watch the fireflies in the garden. And tomorrow, I'm going to James's office to sign the final paperwork for the Evelyn O'Connell Scholarship Fund. After that, I'm booking a flight to Florence. Evie and I spent 40 years talking about seeing the David. I'm going to go, and I'm going to buy the most expensive gelato I can find. I'll carry a small photo of Evie in my pocket, and I'll tell her all about the statues. Justice isn't always about a courtroom. Sometimes justice is simply refusing to let people make you feel small, just because they've forgotten what it means to be big. I am 80 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am completely, wonderfully free.